Hello, everybody, and welcome to this week's version of the Digital Services Forum. Today, we're going to talk about CSDM Lifecycles and what's going on with them in Xanadu. So that's what the topic's going to be. The Digital Service Forum, we have this every other week, and we like to keep a really active chat. So especially if today's your first time, we like for you to put your name in the chat and your company you're with. And let us know that you're a first-time member so that our other members can greet you on the call. So we have two speakers today, and the speakers are going to be from our product management side. Mark Bodman and Scott Lamb will both be here. And today the topic is around the life cycles on CSDM, which is very appropriate for what we've been doing, working through our workshop to build out a model so that everybody understands the moving components and the conversations across the domains. So I think this will be a relevant piece because last week, if you were on the call, we did talk about where the life cycles plug into some of the builders. So this will be great to see the changes and very relevant for what we've been discussing. So they're going to go over the changes, navigating the transition for those of you that already are using life cycles, and then managing the impact or a couple of the topics. But I imagine Mark and Scott will pop around a little bit depending on pop around those different topics. So without further ado, I think I don't know who's going to take over sharing, Scott, whether it would be you or Mark, but I can hand it right off to you guys and let you.
Yeah, Scott, you want me to start, and you'll probably talk to most of the slides, but yeah.
Yep, I'll stop sharing.
I have it up, so I can go ahead and share. And
go ahead. Yeah, I'm just coming from another meeting, so you're probably there faster than I am.
All right.
Perfect.
Get it. Let me know when you all can see my screen.
Yes, sir.
All right, Here we go. All right, so the agenda that Mark and I want to get through, we want to make sure we level set everyone with where this all started and why it all started, and making sure we understand that baseline before going into what those changes are. So understanding what we learned from the original efforts and why we are making the changes in Xanadu that we are. Then, of course, our Q&A, frequently asked questions, and then possibly some visibility into what we're working on in the future. So let's talk about where this all started. Back with CSDM 4, we introduced the concept of life cycle. And with that, what we're trying to accomplish was really normalizing the view of status. Looking at how it was being used previously, all the various statuses with customers, we wanted to make sure that we had a differentiation between the choices available based off of the type of object that we were looking at. Was this something that was physical? Was this something that was logical? Rather than just one long list of stuff and not knowing what was the right piece to choose. But to do that, we needed to make sure it couldn't be edited. And that was a big piece that was a struggle for many folks because the previous statuses were highly editable. And so we wanted to make sure we could control it because we wanted to build some process, some workflow off of these particular values. And we also wanted to make sure that we weren't forcing this on anyone. This was optional. There was no rush to try to use these pieces. We wanted to get it out there. It actually took several releases for us to build this up into what it has become. So why did we do this to begin with? So in the CMDB, just CMDB, and of course asset as well, there's no less than 9 objects to identify the state or the status of a CI or an asset, and they didn't work with each other. So if you chose a particular state or status, it wasn't necessarily logical of what it resulted or if it resulted in modifying another related object. You almost needed a decoder ring to figure out how the legacy statuses were effectively being used and carried through the platform. And so we wanted to make sure we could fix that, normalize that. If we look at the fact from a physical standpoint that a physical asset and then its kind of child or parent CI, they're really two halves of a whole. And we wanted to make sure that we weren't separating those particular pieces. Can we give a consistent look of what a status is across an asset and CI rather than needing that decoder ring to figure out what do I choose on an asset versus what do I choose on a CI? And as we looked at all of these and trying to understand what the values should be and how this could work with an overall process, we found that over half of our customers actually customize the state and status fields to the point where some even customize it so much that it no longer functions and they had to create new custom attributes related to status. So all of that we wanted to fix. We wanted to be simpler and have something a bit more consistent, like a process flow of a status across assets and CIs.
Yeah,
That was how this came together.
I would say a lot of those customers also abused it. They put things like environment in the status fields, like cloud versus non-cloud. It's just all over the place.
Yeah, it wasn't just status. Some things were just part of a workflow to make it easier to know where it was. It wasn't consistent. There was just a lot of stuff going on. I remember my very first customer when I started with ServiceNow going on 12 years ago had the scenario where they had customized it so much that it broke and they couldn't figure out how to fix it, and that's why I was brought in. So we wanted to make it simpler. That was the original goal. Now, what did we learn from all of that? It was a popular concept. Having the ability to have more consistency, know exactly what these values are, and treat it more like a process and limit the choices to being just lifecycle values, wildly popular. But we found out that the way we implemented it with the syncing between the legacy state statuses and the new lifecycle stage status was broken. And we'll go through some of those reasons as we talk through what we're doing in the current release. We also want to make sure everyone knew that sync wasn't what we originally wanted to have happen. We didn't want customers to live in both worlds. We were trying to introduce the new and help everyone use the new. But for many, the new wasn't enough, or we didn't have our products using the new, so we were still stuck in two worlds. And that became an unfortunate reality. Also,
Should I just interrupt you guys with questions or should we wait?
you can interrupt. That's great.
So there's one from Crystal. Did users really abuse it or was its intended purpose of all attributes not clearly explained?
Users abused it.
Yeah.
And it wasn't clearly explained. So it's the best of both worlds. Everything came together to be a perfect storm.
All right,
Yeah.
so Crystal nailed our problem statement.
Yeah. In a matter of fact, I mean, that's part of. There was somebody who spoke, but it was kind of very
it's muted.
low. Okay. So yeah, I think because we didn't have definitions, people did, use it for whatever purpose they saw fit, right? I mean, and we are an open platform, we are tightening the screws, so to speak, so that there is less variability, so that as a product manager, we can automate and depend on the values there and do things, way beyond just an individual status.
I also think it's a point in time. When I started with ServiceNow, we bragged about being highly configurable. And it was a great feature. It was great marketing. And it also hurt because you could easily go in and modify the choices of statuses or any other choice list that was on the platform. We didn't have anything that kept anyone from doing so. And not before we started giving guidance with CSDM did we ever say, this is how you should do it. It was always, well, how would you like to do it? And you can configure it that way, not realizing we are actually hurting ourselves.
Yeah. And one of my first use cases coming in with APM, my goal was to say, if you're going to retire this business application, well, all of the resources that are dedicated to that business application can be retired. I have personal experience at Dell where we did retire business apps, but we didn't retire infrastructure. And when we finally sorted that out, which took about a year, I identified over 1,000 servers that weren't retired, that the business app was long gone, right? Long since retired.
Yep. And I think
Sorry.
that topic, is there a way to differentiate between retired and completely dead? And I think it's retired or deleted, I think is the only option, but is that true?
We can walk through those scenarios when we show the stages and statuses and talk about the new ones that we've introduced.
Perfect. I'll let you get on. Those are the only two for now.
Okay. The last thing I wanted to bring up is just the evolution of ServiceNow. When I started, Asset had just been created as part of Berlin. Before that, if you did asset management of any sort, it was in the CMDB. And we don't, as we all know, get rid of anything inside of the platform. We don't really do a true deprecation across the board. So the statuses that existed prior to Berlin were still there. And then how do you make the new product of asset sync with it? And there goes the decoder ring that is necessary. So we've evolved, and the goal was lifecycle uh, state status would be that next evolution so that we could slowly, truly deprecate the old world when appropriate. So talk about status creep here. This was wildly popular and still is, to the point where we're being asked to include more statuses that we didn't actually originally intend for. And we'll talk a little bit from a roadmap perspective. So we're being asked to use this on other parts of the platform because how we're coming together and unifying it and the approach was seen as favorable. We're now being asked on more objects throughout the platform to have the concept of an organized stage and status. So we had already expanded it to locations. We had already put it on product models, but now we're being asked for other places in the platform, which allows us to look at how we're doing it and seeing if there's a more efficient manner to do it, so that we can expand that capability. And then those customers that truly did have the customizations and were very much married to the workflows they built off of the legacy statuses, they had a challenge in moving into a space that was locked down. And so what is a life cycle versus what is just a status within a workflow? And those conversations had to be had and still are being had. And then the last and most important thing that we learned out of all of this is we didn't do the asset sync. And if the whole goal is to make sure that we have asset and CI aligned, where when they are married, then we probably need to have that sync. And that really is the catalyst for what we were doing in the next iteration and what we have released in Xanadu. So let's talk about the stages and the statuses. So this is the look of the stages that are available in Asset as well as CMDB as of Xanadu. Asset had it just before Xanadu because they got a head start. What they were able to do, because their structure allows them to, historically, their legacy values of state and substate are just two objects with a parent child. That is exactly what lifecycle stage status is. So they're able to add these values to their legacy entries. We don't have that same luxury on the CMDB. So we weren't able to create a one-to-one between our legacy values and the new lifecycle stage status, but Asset was. Now, looking at the values you see here, what I want to point out is a new stage called end of operation. And the desire here was not waiting until end of life to identify that something was pending an activity related to end of life. Instead, let's use end of life to be the actual end. This is the stop where things go. And from a physical asset, physical CI perspective, you can't just say it's retired. Well, what type of retired? We want to make sure that we understand that this particular object has been disposed or donated, returned because it was a lease, etc. All of those pieces we want to make sure was actually done. And then from an asset perspective, we have any of the materials that are needed to prove that those activities were performed. So we didn't want to muddy end of life with still actionable items of pending doing certain things. So that's where it was requested that we add a stage called end of operation. So that activity that occurs right after operation to determine what's next. And so the very first one being pending evaluation. What am I going to do with it? Is this something I'm going to put back in stock and reuse? Is this something I have to get ready to start doing a return or something else? We can put it into pending evaluation, but then once we know what we're doing, then move it into that next activity. It's either back in inventory and it's available, or we're doing a type of disposal or donation and making sure we identify that as pending. The other part, of course, is on hold, making sure that we can identify that this is on hold for legal reasons, and then work through those activities that are largely an asset function. From a CMDB perspective, We care less about the end of operation, end of life, as those are primarily asset functions that manage the workflows in those pieces in many scenarios as it relates to hardware. So we're primarily focused on the operational piece and making sure we understand how things are getting deployed to become operational. So this view is meant to be everything from a product management perspective, an asset management perspective, and configuration management. And as you look at the flow down below, you see when those pieces come into play. And as I mentioned, primarily from a CMDB, we're focused on that being deployed, the fact that it's operational, and then what we're doing it to make it no longer operational. It's end of operation, and then passing it off to the asset team to take care of it. That's the perfect model. And then it's how do we have the products implemented to support this structure? And that's where asset is available to take care of these structures and tied to that capability. I'll pause there. Were there thoughts or questions on the physical view?
Well, Scott, we got a lot of questions coming in. I don't know if they're specific to this view, but I think we need to go a little further because I see a lot of them that we're going to be addressing in a minute. So,
Okay. All right, so that's the physical view. Let's move into logical. So similar to what we already had, and what you don't have so much here is the asset space, unless this is tied to software asset and ordering type scenarios with an entitlement. But for the most part, we're talking about the flows that are necessary for bringing logical items into the CMDB. And again, we added that end of operation with a pending evaluation. This isn't an area where we'd go through a disposal mechanism for physical hardware. So this is focused more from the logical perspective. And so the end of operation just has the pending evaluation. Am I truly retiring this, or are there other activities that need to be done, making sure and notifying any folks that need to be notified. So this is the logical view. Any thoughts or questions on the logical perspective? All right. So let's get into what
One
we
question.
actually did. Yeah.
Hi, it's Alan Prohaska. Why is there only one value under deploy? That suggests that when you go into deploy, there's only one thing you're doing. Test. Can you comment?
Yeah, because the prior piece to that is it's in build. And so we wanted to make sure that we were identifying that the build has been completed and now it's going through its testing so that it can be deployed, and then it becomes deployable.
Okay. Thanks.
yeah, so build is in design. So you can say it's a combination of design, of stage and status. So we account for those previous activities in that design stage.
Okay.
Yeah, I
So
think that
move
makes
on.
sense. I think that makes sense. Like, I mean, before in use, that's the stage that's before it. I mean, so testing, right? You're not going to release anything and start using it.
Right.
Yeah.
We wanted to make sure that's in testing and validate that it hit that stage, assuming that's important to organizations.
Yeah. And just sorry, just so I can ground this, for an example, like when we talk about CIs for the physical, we're talking about servers, OT devices, things like that. Logical is all software.
Software, services, anything that is
Services, yeah.
physical. Yeah.
Right. Okay, thanks.
Yeah, software is your typical one because there's a physicality of a software. It's depending on whatever server it's on, but we still like application services are a good one. It's purely logical.
What's the
Okay.
rationale for build being in design versus deploy? Seems odd on the face of it to my brain, but
So you have to build it before you can deploy it.
Right, but when you build, you're actually committing to doing something. When you're in design, you're still thinking about it.
Yeah, but you're not necessarily. You could design things and never go to deploy it ever. It could be an experiment and it never actually gets deployed.
so what do you mean by build in that case? Is that really develop, or or is it development work, or are you actually pushing that approved piece of code or whatever into actually deploying it onto servers? I guess I think maybe it's a difference of semantic definition of the term build.
Mm-hmm.
It's depending on the environment you're in. Probably in the design phase, you're gonna build things in test or dev or whatever. And the deploy is when everything is tested all right and you're gonna go to production. That's how I would see it. But
Yeah, we identified the build status to represent that it's in that DevOps space. It has not been deployed. It is currently actively being built. And we're not going into the details of the
this
build.
is using CI/CD or something like this, and it goes out from the fact that you don't do things manually anymore, but that you just cycle through it with the automation.
And we're not trying to micro manage the details here. The fact that it's been designed, it's been chartered, which means yes, we're going to move forward. We have a design for it. Now we're passing it off to DevOps. Where is it at in DevOps? That's where this product model is being referenced in the DevOps space, so you can get the details of it. But we're not necessarily creating a CI at the design build phase. We would prefer to have that CI created once we're moved from deployment into operational.
Makes sense, but just based on the terms, I think some good explanation of that will help people make that transition. 'Cause I think some people might look at build and think of something different.
Agreed,
So,
understood. And
manage that, yeah.
We gapped on in CSDM4 when we introduced all of this is we didn't provide the definitions. And so with CSDM5, as we've already started putting materials together for that release to come next year, it's going to have the definitions and the scenarios for each and every one of these stages and statuses.
Yeah. The other thing is that we're working with the different product teams that are responsible for using or setting these, along the different stages of the life cycle, because there's different products that are involved and at different layers. And then they have to be able to use these and automate these as much as possible as well. I think digital product release, for example, is a kind of a pivotal element in the process now, which kind of helps to drive and automate some of these.
This may just be a diagramming thing, but one of my pieces of confusion came is that when you look at that top line of the 7 boxes, first thing you think is, oh, that's a life cycle. It goes through those 7, but inventory never goes into deploy. So you might think about pulling deploy down so that it's clear that it goes design, deploy, operational, or it could go inventory operational. It's just a visual thing.
Okay, thanks.
Good stuff. Thanks for this. Keep going.
All right, so what did we do?
Sorry, one more question on that. Do you provide or do you suggest, so this is kind of a state with state transitions, but there's no real discussion on what the state transition is or provides that transition and whether or not you can revert back. For example, we just recently had an issue where we had disposed of a server. They pulled it off the truck, they brought it back in, they redeployed it for another purpose. And so Discovery found the exact same CI, became the same serial number. So it was already thought this was something that it had, and the class had changed, everything had changed. So what exactly are legal state transitions from the individual states? Or
legal state transitions?
Yeah. In other words, I might not be able to go directly from retired back to discovered or something along those lines.
Yeah.
I might not be able to go from operational back to first discovered. There may be state transitions that are allowed and state transitions that are not.
So that edge case is exactly one of the reasons why we developed the activity and the sync the way we did in our Xanadu release. So I'm actually going to bring up that exact scenario.
Perfect.
Lived that. Okay. Anything else? Anyone else? Okay, so let's talk about Xanadu.
Yes, sorry.
Oh my God.
Sorry. So is VMware considered the logical side or the physical side?
Neither. We're going to talk about that as a roadmap piece.
Okay.
So what you've introduced, and again, we're going to talk about the detail in the roadmap piece. As we bring up hardware versus logical, we base these on classes. So we determined which stage, which status was available and viewable based off of the class. And initially, that was great because it was better than what we had. What we had was one long list of statuses, whether it was for that CI or not, you had the same choices no matter what CI you chose. So we started to move towards that's not appropriate. Let's have things that are specific to hardware versus logical. The gap was virtual, and we'll talk about that in roadmap here shortly.
Question, why would we care whether it's physical, logical, or configured infrastructure? These are the phases, right? Does it matter what it's deployed upon?
What it's deployed on, it's what that
Talking
actual
about-
CI is. Is
Talk about
that
the life
CI?
cycle here. Talk about the life cycle and whether or not we're ordering a server from Amazon or we're ordering a server from the local computer store doesn't matter.
Correct, but we're not talking about that.
Okay,
No.
get there. I'm jumping ahead. Sorry. Go ahead.
No, it's not jumping ahead. A physical device, you're going to order it. Correct. I don't care where it's from. And once you receive it, you're going to put it into inventory. And at some point, you're going to deploy it. That doesn't matter where you get it from. A physical item is going to have this type of a flow, but software is not. Software is not going to order it and then put it into inventory. There's no such thing as an inventory really for software. And we're not going to have a disposal or donation or sold for an end of life. So the choices aren't the same for every CI.
Right.
That's what we had with the legacy. So no matter
Right.
what you chose or what you had for a status, it was the same choices no matter what.
We're still going to terminate at EC2, but we're not going to have to send it down to the local recycling center. I'm with you.
Exactly. Or you can't lose it, you know, it can't be stolen.
Not
Right.
physical, no. Yeah.
Nope.
Stolen,
that's
but yeah, I know what you're saying. Yeah, I'm good.
So we wanted to have the process match the type of item it was. And at the time, we chose the class
Right.
to be that differentiator, but that breaks. And we'll talk about that here shortly.
Sounds good.
Hey, Scott, Jackie, I have a question about logical CIs. So what we tend to do is we create a draft application service, if you will, like an on order status, and then we wait for the technical team to deploy resources, and then it would all tag based map back to that application service. We used to have it as on order status, but where would you recommend that in the new lifecycle stage? Which stage would that be? Would you recommend that to be?
So you're waiting on them to deploy to it?
And we're waiting on them to deploy Azure resources. And then when we do discovery, it'll all tag back to that draft application service record. So maybe it's design, deploy, operational. Where would I put that?
I would think design would be a good home for that, at least initially, because it's not operational yet. You haven't deployed anything to it.
Right.
You're waiting for them to deploy to it. So I would consider design.
Awesome. Thank you.
Any other thoughts or questions?
There's a lot of questions, but I think we need to get to some of those at the end because I'm sure, you know, we'll get to some, we'll be answering some of them, but not all of them.
All right, so going into Xanadu, what we had as a primary piece we needed to get done was syncing with asset so that obviously, we're talking from a hardware perspective, whatever lifecycle stage status value you had on a CI was the same on the asset and vice versa. So going into development, what existed was we had our CMDB, we had our install, our legacy values, we had our new lifecycle stage status values, we had syncing going on between them, which wasn't syncing well because they weren't one-to-one values. And that caused a lot of issues for many organizations because it wasn't a one-to-one. Either we had a value in lifecycle stage status that didn't exist in legacy, so there was no mapping back to it, or we had values that were in the legacy that had multiple choices. And so we can only choose one, but if there was multiple coming back, what does that do coming back? Also, From a legacy perspective, we already had for many, many years since Berlin, the synchronization that occurred between legacy values on our CMDB and legacy values inside of asset. So that already existed there. And the asset team, along with our CSM team, had already created a sync onto the install base item. So the goal long-term was to make sure that regardless of what object you're on, if you're on a CI, an asset, or an install base item in CSM, you would see consistently the same lifecycle stage and status across the board. So we needed to get this synchronization created. That was our motivation going into Xanadu. In doing so, we could just create that synchronization. And as soon as we did, we had 133 collisions where the values that were available didn't match based off of what we had in legacy and what we had coming in with the asset pieces. It just caused more problems. And it was an endless loop that had no solution. So that didn't work. So then we tried a different approach. What if we got rid of all of the syncing? And that way we just looked at the syncing from the legacy across the board to the asset. Because it's a one-to-one in asset, they added all those values we just looked through to their legacy state and substate. It became a one-to-one with the lifecycle stage status. So if we work with the legacy synchronization, then this started to work. This is where we reduced and eliminated the collisions. We started with 133. We did another round of tweaking. We got down to 9. 9 is still too many. So this is where we landed and where we were able to keep all 3 objects synced and still be able to use the legacy attributes. But the legacy attributes are syncing through the age-old useful sync that existed with asset before. So this is actually where we ended up landing and what we ended up providing. So again, we tried different iterations to make this try to work. In the end, the only way that we were able to make sure all 3 objects could stay synced is if we removed the synchronization we created when we introduced lifecycle stage status. So with the Xanadu release, there is the option, and it's still optional, to enable this view of lifecycle stage status. If you have already enabled lifecycle stage status, so you're in what this is today, you can continue with what this is today. If you enable the new, what it's going to do is just remove that sync between the legacy and the new and make sure what exists within the legacy sync that existed before all of this is set up properly and there's no mismatches there. That's what we put through in Xanadu.
So it's fair to say in Xanadu, this should be a cleaner implementation, and we'll get to some of the Xanadu features as well in a minute. And in terms of keeping the statuses in sync, there'd be less collisions and less undetermined results that tend to happen.
So did you remove the CSDM lifecycle mapping table to do this?
No, we actually still want that, and for very good reason.
Okay.
One of the things, and we have it on another slide, but I'll explain it here. What we wanted to make sure is that we still understood in spirit when these weren't matching. Because what we learned from customers is that they wanted to know that these were the same, and they wanted to know when they weren't. And this kept them from misalignment. So what we did is we're adding into our CSDM dashboard a report that looks at, and we're focused on operational status, not looking at install status or hardware status, but we're looking at operational status. And the fact that it's operational in operational status, we're looking to see is the lifecycle stage operational. And if that is a mismatch, that's where we're flagging that in that report in the dashboard. That report can then be actionable. So you can add tasks that get kicked off if something pops up in there, but we didn't want to force that. So customers that wanted to be more controlling and immediately create tasks to go fix this, or they just wanted to know it existed, because this is where we came into that edge case. And I've lived this in previous lives. I was in higher ed, and it was the scenario where we take that hardware, we send it to property disposition, and it gets sold. Problem is, it was a professor that bought it, brings it back in for his research, puts it back on the network, and it pops back up. So what we're looking at is, from a lifecycle stage status perspective, it's going to have a value of end of life sold. But when we look at operational status and discovery runs again, and it sees it and it says, hey, this is operational, that's that edge case scenario where we're going to see that difference between the two. And that's what we want to bring up and make sure is visible and seen. And that's the type of stuff that we're focused on, making sure this still worked.
Yeah, because what drives the operational status is when it's discovered, right? And we've
If we
even
could relabel it, I don't know if we'd call it operational status, right, Mark?
yeah,
It's
like
pretty
this, we were
powerful.
talking about relabeling it to discovered status, right? So that would make it clearer, because that's really what's happening there, you know?
Not everything's discovered though. Not everything
No.
had, you know, your edge cases with data sources pushing data in are gonna work this scenario. And I think the question was posted, pardon my interruption. I was curious how this looks for a virtual where I don't have asset information. Am I looking at a different strategy or the original strategy for those things that we do not track as an asset?
So when you say virtual, everything that is not extended off of CMDB-CI hardware, almost everything. There's about 4 more classes that come off of CMDB-CI that are physical. But then everything that's extended off of CMDB-CI hardware is considered physical in this view, and so they're going to have the physical approach to all of those pieces. Anything that's not extended off of those, so the VMwares, those elements where we start to identify cloud, they're going to use the logical piece.
So to circle back to my original question that kind of was the edge case that I am assuming this was addressing.
Yep.
Part of the issue is the class actually changed, because when they repurposed the server, it was no longer a Windows server. It was now an appliance, a service appliance, because it was not actually a Windows server. It was a standalone OS from turning this piece of hardware into a network appliance.
Is it still being discovered with
it's still being was being discovered, yes, still being discovered, and it was still
number?
by serial number. So it was getting the ESN off of the motherboard still, but it was no longer technically a Windows operating system in that context.
And that's fine, because we're able to reclass.
Okay, but that would be like a business rule or something else that we'd have to do. We'd have to flag it somehow to say, hey, this has been rediscovered. We thought it was dead. It was rediscovered. Is everything correct? Is that how we would handle that type of scenario?
So an option is based off of that report, because that would pop up to say, hey,
yeah,
we saw it. We see that this is end of life, but operational status, because it just got discovered again, is operational.
Perfect.
And then that's the report. And then you can get a task to say investigate. I mean, you don't know exactly what happened yet, but you pretty much can guess.
Right.
And so just an investigation task that is keyed off of that, you can go ahead and implement.
Cool. Okay. Perfect.
The other thing in that scenario, it's the same exact asset, right? You're just configuring it differently.
That's correct.
Yeah.
Right. But sadly, out of the box, there is no OS component off of hardware. There's just server components off of hardware. And so really, we changed the configuration. It's no longer a Windows server. It's a different, could be, heck, I could have done the same thing, pulled it off and put a Linux OS on, and the serial number would have still been the same, because the motherboard's got the serial number. So there's no way for us to identify. Sadly, there's a missing software component in hardware, which is OS.
Well, it'll still have the history that it previously was in the Windows.
Right,
class.
but you can't search for it anymore that way, right? So in terms of people wanting to say, hey, well, what happened to this thing? It's not that thing anymore. So you
should
could
be
even go
the relationship to the asset, though, shouldn't it? The asset should see the change in configuration item, or the relationship to another configuration item.
Right. But if they were going to go back and say, hey, what happened to my old Windows server? Didn't we dispose of my old Windows server? It's not going to show up in that class anymore.
Correct. It will be related to the asset record and you could find it from there.
Okay.
That record should still be there. It should be a
It
brand
is.
new record when it comes back in as a Linux server, right?
Well, no, because it's going off a serial number, and Discovery says, "Oh, I know what this is. It's a Windows server."
Right. It's
I guess
not
that
going to
would
be a new record. It's just going to change its class. So it's a change in its configuration data. The
Yeah.
asset is still the same, and the asset holds the fact that you disposed of it. So
Okay.
if you're
we
saying,
we
"Here's
create
that
new
Windows,"
records.
No,
We have
Discovery's
teams that recreate every time, and then they don't want to open up the old server because it has a new mission. So we forcibly set a new CI versus allowing the restoration of the old.
No, and that's what we prefer too. I want, once it's disposed, I want it to be dead and have it come back and say, "Oh, look, here's
Right.
a serial." I would prefer it to be a new CI also, but Discovery is currently reusing the CI that it already found.
the best practice is to not create a new CI because you do preserve all of the history on it.
Right.
But yeah,
It's
but
just
Ours does not support that case for our
Yeah.
customer. It wants a new CI each time. So
There's no
Yeah.
right and wrong in here,
There's
guys.
not.
Right, right, right,
There
right.
is pros and cons on both. So if you detach the CI from the asset and you add a new one to it, indeed you lose the incidents because they are registered on the CI side. But it does give you the advantage that you have a clearer history on the old CI that is detached from
Yes.
the asset. So there
All
is
right.
pros and cons for both. There
Right.
is no right or wrong. It's just
Cool.
that out of the box, it doesn't do it. It reacts like if Discovery finds something new on an existing asset, it will just override the CI with the new information.
Yes.
And that's just choice.
Yeah, we have a lot more to cover in 15 minutes to cover it. And we'll try to get to all the questions, obviously, but if not, we can come back and answer some of those offline or in the community.
So if a customer has not implemented lifecycle stage status yet, and in Xanadu wants to implement it, it's going to go straight to the new configuration. If a customer has already implemented lifecycle stage status, they can maintain it and keep the way they are, or they can add an optional, it's not forced. Go ahead and implement this new strategy that eliminates that sync, but we still kept the mapping and the need to do mapping because that helps us do that activity to identify when operational status and the stage are out of sync. We don't care the actual lifecycle status chosen, that's just a flavor. We just want to know, do we consider this operational or not? So that implementation piece, when you go to enable lifecycle, the button there, it's going to go through and it's going to look at that legacy synchronization and see if there are any areas where it might have a mapping issue. And so it's going to present those to you. So you have those particular details. And so that becomes the first stage. And so that's where Mark said this becomes a bit simpler moving forward because it actually identifies what those are so that you can go through and remediate those.
Yeah, the nice thing is that as you identify these, it's kind of like gamification. It's like, oh, I removed 2, but I got 5 more to go, right? And eventually you'll get them all removed, and then you'll get a kind of a clean report, if you will.
And from that perspective, also we wanted to make sure that we added some details in that activation to say how long this was going to take to update the records based off of the mappings and those pieces that had already been done. What would it take to then carry through and make sure that we've got the CI and the asset completely synced up? So we give you an estimate of how long that's going to take and let that run in the background.
Yeah, we had to do that because when you activate this, it's going to convert or map everything in the whole system, the whole instance. And so that can take a heck of a long time. So this estimate will allow you to kind of enable these things more incrementally if you need to, and just see what to expect. So any questions on this one? This is sort of the big changes in Xanadu basically outlined here. All right.
Quick question. So like we do the dedupes on the servers and computers and networking equipment for the same serial number. Would that affect with this new life cycle sync, would that have any effect to that?
I don't believe so.
Okay.
Okay.
All right. So now for the question time.
Yeah,
And
let's I think a lot of these are being asked already too. So we'll probably catch some of yours in the frequently asked questions.
All right. So what products support the new life cycles? So the big one that we need to make sure that we had supporting was asset. That was our top request from customers, because when it comes to disposal and all of those activities, that's being done from an asset perspective, as well as many of the onboarding pieces. So we wanted to make sure asset was fully on board and using them. And so at this point, they become fully on board, as well as the objects being synced. From an ITOM perspective, ITOM is updating the object from a licensing perspective to know what to count as licensing based off of what's operational. That piece is being done. And then we have, as part of our CSDM 5 internal mandate, to ensure that the rest of the business units are supportive and using the new pieces. But asset was the biggest one we had to get done.
All right. So there's a lot of questions on specific products adoption, and we don't really publish that. It's one of those product by product kind of questions you'll have to look at. I think APM, for example, adopted the new life cycles pretty early on, but not all the other products have adopted it and are using it. But the new ones that are coming out is it fair to say that all the new ones are going to be using the new life cycles?
Correct. The most teams don't want to use the old ones at all, because the new ones are that clean view and definitive, as opposed to the old ones being configurable and often modified. So all of the new teams and new product lines are all using the new lifecycle stage status.
And as new products come online, this is where we extend them. And I know on the telecom BU activities, we're even talking about adding a third component to that. I don't know if you want to talk about that at all.
Right. So we never intended these to be the only stages and statuses. If there were reasons and supported reasons of anything needed to be added, we're open to adding them. We just didn't want it to be a wild, wild west type of environment. So every time a new product line comes up and says, we want a status, this is where I was talking about status creep. We want to add a status attribute. No, you're not going to add a status attribute. What is it you want to track and work through? And as Mark alluded to earlier, sometimes it's not actually a life cycle. They just want to know elements from a workflow perspective. And we work through language to make sure status is a very, very specific element in how it's being used. And in working with telecom, as an example that Mark brought up, we've already identified 2 statuses to add into the stages that are useful across the board for everyone, not just for telecom. And so those scenarios will be added here in the near future. So those are the type of pieces where, as we work with customers, as we work with internal business units, we are happy to add to it with supporting structures for that use case.
Yeah, and I think there was one of the views earlier that had install base item. There was a quick question about that. It was answered, but that's another example as the new products come online, add elements like IBA. So product, we're expanding the life cycle to cover those as well.
Right. We've even had requests to add it to groups, to add it to other places as well. Anyways, because it's seen as a nice control object of a life cycle, and that's where we're happy to expand, but make sure we can do it properly.
Yes. Yep. So you watch for more use as it matures and gets rolled out across the board.
So an example of one of the choices that isn't really a life cycle, and we have it here as one of the frequently asked questions, is what about the hot standby or those types of environments where we're managing the disaster recovery scenarios. And those aren't life cycles. We consider them to be more of their own data element. And so we're working with various teams in the platform to identify the best way to capture that and display that, as well as manage it. So it's not just having an attribute on a CI, but how does this interact with risk and ITOM and other places? So developing a more holistic stance on how that is to overall be managed, but it's not part of a life cycle, so to speak.
Right. Separate those two concerns, right, as appropriate.
Yeah.
Another one I get a lot of questions about CMDB Data Manager. CMDB Data Manager deals with end of life scenarios and ongoing certification, data certification, or attestation. You don't need to use the new life cycles. That flexibility was opened up a few releases ago. I think I want to say Vancouver. It's still a good practice to use the new ones. That would be a recommendation, but the data manager was opened up to use any field as its trigger. This is the next question is one we get a lot. Life cycles for hot standby versus active.
And that's what we just talked about.
Yeah. So that one is pretty pretty common anyways.
Yeah, so we're actively working with ITOM and the risk team to identify a better way to manage those pieces.
Yeah. Operational status going away or any of the other legacy stuff?
Operational status, we feel needs to stay because that becomes not so much what it has historically been, which is operational, is it operational or not, but more from a discovery status standpoint. Has discovery seen it or not? And because that's really where it gets flagged, and Discovery automatically updating that, saying, yeah, this has been seen. So it flags as operational. If you have something like Data Manager or other rules in place that says, hey, this hasn't been seen in a period of time, flip it back to non-operational. That has
Scott, if you look at the chat, you'll see that there is a lot of comments on that, because it's not because something is seen on the network that it is operational. It can be seen on the network and either still being built, it could be on the network but currently in a bad state, or it could be many things. It's not up to Discovery to say whether or not something is operational. That's why we have change management. And a change management that says whether or not something is operational. Discovery just says it's there or it's not, and it's replying. But it doesn't, Discovery is a process that should never manage operational state in my eyes. It can tell you it's installed and on the network, but it doesn't tell you whether or not our customers if it's fit for purpose for our customers to use. And
which
for
is
me,
why
that's
we
what
said
the operational
earlier,
state actually says.
But that's why we said earlier we don't like that label. We don't feel it's an actual operational status. It's how it's being used and implemented by ITOM, but we don't feel it reflects operational. We agree with you. We feel that that's more of a discovery status. Now,
wouldn't that be more? So our camps are like install status would be more with what is discovered. Hey, it's there. We know it's installed, but it's not operational yet. And that would be like what Mark was saying, change control.
Yeah. That's how we see it, but good. And that's for primary things only, because when you look at things, the dependent classes, for me, that's fine as saying that they are absent or not.
Well, that's kind of what we were saying earlier about the operational status is driven by discovery, the fact that it was discovered or came in from a third party that indicates it's still there. But yeah, there is discussion on what do we do with it next and how do we better characterize it.
Is that a new behavior? The Discovery never touched operational status before.
Yeah, it has.
Yeah, that's my experience.
That's going to mess up everything we have, because everything is. The assumption is Discovery never changes operational status.
It used to be like that, but in the last couple of releases, Discovery is changing the operational status, and it is creating a chaos on the system.
That's we need to talk about this offline.
Yeah, I think this goes into the bigger picture and how do we workflow this effectively so that we are using the right information at the right time to make the right decision. That's the challenge.
Yep.
Next one is recommended use both legacy and CSDM lifecycles at the same time. I think it's fair to say yeah, but I don't know, Scott, what do you think? I mean, I do see a lot of customers using them on the forums so that you can compare and contrast to make sure you got all your business logic set up, your workflows set up that are accounting for both.
It's the necessary evil for the short term, long term, we want it to do away with the legacy, aside from operational status or some view of a discovery status. So we want to move away from having to have them. Can you use them both today? Yes, with those caveats of making sure that that synchronization is working in the new method. But we ultimately, roadmap wise, we want to move to the CSDM lifecycles.
All right, and anything next on this? I think we mentioned a few things along the way, but anything else, Scott, that you can mention that we're working through?
Well, the big one next is we want to take care of that virtual scenario, because the way we architected this, it's based off of a class in the CMDB. But if you look at server class, and any of those server CIs could be a virtual server, then we are forcing the hardware choices on that because it's seen as a hardware class. So in looking at that scenario and how do we take care of virtual systems, we're also looking at, do we base this off of class or do we find another mechanism? So we're looking at how this can be made more efficient, while at the same time identifying what do we do for the virtual machines. And then what are the choices for a virtual machine? Because those aren't the same as what you see there for physical or logical. So looking at the various virtualization mechanisms and what they identify as statuses. If you go into our virtual objects today, you'll see a state attribute, and that is specific, I believe, to AWS, but that's not necessarily the same choices you would expect in all virtualization. So we're essentially looking at virtualization, which also forces us to look at the mechanism that we determine the choices at the same time. That's
State is an attribute of the VMI, though, right? Not of the record within the what you're calling the hardware table, say Windows.
Correct.
But
when
that's,
you
that's
say
the problem, I think, with the Windows. Huh? It is both representing the logical part and the physical part, which for me isn't right. If you look at the VMI, we don't have a counterpart for an asset, only on the asset side, but not in the CMDB. Only on the asset side, we have that counterpart. And so if you look at it, for me, these are two of the same things. It's the physical hardware is represented on the virtual side in that VMI, the container that you install that operating system in. And on the server side, we are actually mixing both concepts. We are mixing what is the operating system and what is the hardware on it.
Yeah, that's why I was saying earlier there was a missing OS class. We just jumped right to server.
I think the Windows Server is actually the OS class.
Yeah.
And what is missing is not the operating system. I think what is missing is the hardware part on the CI side.
All right,
we're doing both on the same object, and that's where this
right. That's why I'm saying you're combining server class under hardware to be distinguishable by the OS that is loaded on. I can have the VM and I can put any OS I want on that VM.
Mm-hmm.
And so using the variable, it just doesn't seem that it follows. You need something else to split them into two.
So that's why you see that this becomes a separate topic, and that's our next piece in the roadmap to work through. And it's not a simple solution because it forces us to have that conversation of what we did in the past. Are we going to continue to follow that? And how do we fix this moving forward? So it's not going to be done overnight. This is one where I'm truly forcing everyone to come to the table and talk through those very difficult conversations that are based off of the past.
Yep.
All right. We're at time. I know there's a lot of maybe unanswered questions and topics we can get into. I think we'll look at the
I'll send the chat over to you guys, Mark.
Yeah, we'll analyze that and maybe we'll tee up a second session to go into some of these edge cases or whatever. But thank you very much. Thank you, Scott, for kind of driving this. It was really helpful to capture this, and I hope we got most of your questions answered, at least to some degree. So
no, that was a softball. Next time we'll pick a harder topic. Thanks, guys.
Thank you.
No, very helpful. Thanks, guys.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Have a good one.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.